So, several big things are shifting in Russia right now. Not, of course, on the battlefield. Unsurprisingly, little progress of them there, although we'll get to that. No, in this case, it's around the language coming out of some of Russia's most loyal voices. Vladimir Solovyov, the man who has spent years calling for nuclear strikes on Ukrainian cities, who's told his viewers that Kiev and its Western allies serve the Princess of Darkness, and who's built his entire brand on this aggressive military triumphalism, has been on air throughout June and telling Russians to prepare for hardships, self-sacrifice, to endure the war that was seemingly never going to come home. Indeed, this is not the language of a country that is winning. That is not even the language of a country that believes it is winning anymore. That is the language of a regime that has looked at where things are heading and decided that it needs to start managing expectations before that gap between the official narrative and the observable reality becomes impossible to bridge, which in some people's eyes is already happening. And this shift is happening at the exact moment that NATO allies are gathering in Ankara, Turkey, for one of the most consequential summits in the alliance recent history. Indeed, I will be doing a review of the NATO summit, so be sure to subscribe for that. And indeed, what is being agreed in that room this week makes the picture for Russia considerably more complicated, or in some people's eyes, just simply more darker than the propagandists are ever going to admit.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the show where, if you're regular, you'll know that I've spent ages watching how Russia talks about itself, the language it uses, what it emits versus what it hides, what it signals when those two things start to diverge, and how this all weaves into the broader great power competition that we're seeing between the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, and many different aspects. So what do you think about this current shift in Russia's narrative standpoint in this sort of information warfare aspect, and how this weaves into the NATO summit that we are seeing right now? Let me know in the comments, as well as anything else you'd like to see me cover during the next few days of the summit. Let's start with the battlefield, because the official Russian narrative that the war is progressing according to plan, that Ukraine is being grounded down, that victory is a matter of time and near certainty, doesn't survive contact with the actual data. As some of you will know from previous iterations I've done in the past couple of weeks, more and more data is becoming apparent, including from Russian bloggers themselves, about the literal timescale Russian recruits have to last. Around, some people reckon, 30 minutes on average. But now there's more data showing that Russian monthly territorial gains have fallen sharply compared to the same period last year. So in May of this year, Russian forces saw their smallest monthly gains since October 23, around 14 kilometers square, despite a 37.5 spike in the number of assault attempts. Ukraine has also been recapturing territory this year, and according to the Institute for the Study of War, which is a Western entity, the Ukrainian forces have largely halted the Russian spring-summer offensive, although the idea of a spring-summer offensive has become so predictable at this point, I don't really see the point in referencing. But let's stop on that for a second. Russia has been increasing its assault attempts by more than a third and achieved its worst territorial results in nearly 3 years. That is not an army that is grinding down its opponent. Indeed, that is one that is being grinded down by its own actions, throwing more at the problem and getting less and less back each time, otherwise known as diminishing returns. But it gets even worse when you look at what Russia is actually working with. Western sanctions are finally beginning to demonstrate their use. They are shrinking its industrial capacity, its stocks of nearly all weapon categories are dwindling, and critically, its air defense architecture has a fundamental structural flaw now that is being brutally exposed. Zelensky himself said in an interview just yesterday that the war will be defined by the air now. The Black Sea is largely, Ukrainian dominated, and the land is being significantly undermined. So it's the air, with drones, of course, where it will be most important. Now, Russia's existing air defense systems were designed for the Cold War. They were built to intercept fast-moving ballistic missiles from state adversaries. They were not built for these swarms of slow, low-flying cheap drones operated via Starlink at ranges over 100 kilometers. To properly defend its airspace along this 1,200-kilometer front line, its border with Ukraine and its Black Sea coast, Russia needs therefore a minimum of 6,000 what are known as Pantsir mobile air defense systems with trained crews and sufficient missiles. It has none, though, in the pipeline. None are coming. And that single fact explains almost everything else that we're about to get into. So be sure to stick around to the very end to understand how this all plays in. So while Russia's propagandists are shifting their language from triumph to endurance, NATO allies have just started the two-day summit this week in Ankara, doing something that directly undermines the narrative Putin has been selling to his domestic audience for 4 years. Now, to remind you, the narrative goes something like this. Western support for Ukraine is politically unsustainable. It's politically inconsistent. European democracies will eventually tire of the cost. America will and has already significantly pulled back, and therefore this overall coalition, the alliance, will fracture. Russia just simply needs to outlast and outmaneuver. But what is being agreed in Ankara this week is the clearest signal yet that that narrative isn't just wrong, it's going completely the opposite direction. Allies are expected to formally commit about 70 billion in additional military assistance to Ukraine. Not just this year, but next year as well. That's a 2-year commitment on top of the 90 billion that the Europeans did in December, January. Now that number was actually proposed by Germany, a country that started off on all of shorts being incredibly opposed to supporting Ukraine. And based on an assessment Ukraine shared with allies, it's being more influential in the willingness of Europeans to listen to Ukraine on what they actually need. Indeed, NATO diplomats describe it as a realistic level of ambition, sufficient to meet Kiev's military needs without being politically unattainable or politically risky amongst voters. Now, the significance also goes beyond the money, because for the first time, the summit declaration will formally recognize Ukraine not just as a passive recipient of NATO's support, but as an active contributor to Allied security. That is not a diplomatic language for its own sake. It reflects something very tangible. Ukraine's advances in its drone warfare, its battlefield innovation, its rapidly expanding defense industry. Indeed, all this emphasis that Ukraine is the front line and has the ability to advise NATO is now finally being recognized. Ukraine is negotiating drone production agreements with 15 NATO states. It has signed drone deals with European countries and Gulf states more broadly. And its defense industry is being integrated into NATO's industrial base in ways that would have been unthinkable 2-3 years ago. And of course, Zelensky will be at the table, invited to a dinner of NATO leaders, his second meeting with Trump in just under a month. And all of that following Zelensky himself describing as a very good conversation with Trump he had over the weekend. Trump also spoke with Putin, although the details around how that conversation went are hard to tell. Whatever comes out of these discussions, though, that a direction of travel is clear. Ukraine's financial agreements for the next 2 years are being locked in. Now, caveat, the United States is not akin to that, but its integration into the broader Western defense industry networks is accelerating, and Putin's bet that the coalition would fracture is not paying off. Indeed, one can argue that the propensity for Trump to be more sympathetic to Ukraine's perspective could also make things even worse in the next few months, depending upon whether Trump shifts on supporting Ukraine again. Putin's calculation, though, has always been that time favors Russia. What is being built in Ankara this week is a direct challenge to that calculation, and arguably the most significant strategic setback from a diplomatic or political standpoint, not directly involved yet. But it also demonstrates that at this point, NATO is firmly involved in this conflict in a way that some people would have argued it hasn't been before. But more interestingly, Ukraine has figured something out that Russia is still catching up to. You don't have to match your opponent in every dimension to defeat them. Now, that might sound obvious, but you have to find the dimensions where your advantages compound fastest and press them relentlessly, the idea of comparative advantage. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign is the clearest expression of this, using domestically produced drones guided via Starlink, the technology Russia has no equivalent for and cannot replicate under current sanctions. Ukraine has been using this to strike Russian oil refineries, fuel depots, military logistics, and energy structure at a tempo and at distances that Russia's air defense cannot consistently, if at all, intercept. We've seen the implications of this in Moscow and St. Petersburg over the past 2 months or so. Now the results are very visible inside Russia in ways that weren't possible even 6 months ago or a year ago. Russia has officially sanctioned what it calls a temporary decrease in fuel quality as a policy response to the refinery damage. That is a government formally acknowledging it can no longer supply its own population with properly refined fuel. Rationing has been introduced across more than 17 regions, and Russia has temporarily banned diesel exports as well. So one of the world's largest energy producers is having to ration its own exports. And it's not just about the fuel. Russia's military investment choices are now looking like exactly the miscalculation they were. Specifically that Moscow bet heavily on Iskander ballistic missiles and Shahed derivative drones, weapons that are effective at striking Ukrainian cities, but provide no answer at all to the problem of defending Russian rear areas from Ukrainian attack. As some people have put it directly, that's something that lets Russia painfully strike Ukraine, but doesn't solve the defense of Russia's own territory. You have offensive and defensive capabilities, and Russia has put all its emphasis on offensive means in Ukraine, which has not proven much success. It's completely neglected its own defense. But meanwhile, Ukraine isn't standing still. This week, Ukraine's Firepoint, otherwise it's known as its domestic missile and drone manufacturer, announced a successful flight test of the FP7 ballistic missile, which will form the basis of their future Fraser anti-ballistic interceptor. Indeed, Ukraine is moving at such a rate it's building its own Patriot alternative from scratch and under war conditions. So this is the asymmetrical dynamic in plain view. Russia is spending vast resources trying to hold a line it is losing slowly but consistently. Meanwhile, Ukraine is simultaneously defending that line and building the next generation of weapons to press this advantage further. Now, this is the point I want to dwell on for a moment, because it reframes almost everything Russia is doing right now. Russia's mass strikes in Ukrainian cities, the Iskander on the Kiev apartment building, the drone attacks on food storage areas, on postal depots, these are war crimes, but they also signal something else, a military signal. When a military has operational momentum, when it's making genuine progress on the battlefield, when its logistics are functioning, industrial bases producing, it does not need to resort to mass civilian strikes as its primary mode of pressure. It applies pressure through battlefield success. The terror campaign, as people call it, is what you do when the battlefield option isn't working. Some analysts have said starkly that Russia's tactics stem from its fundamental organizational, intellectual, technical, and technological weaknesses. These Iskandias raining down on Kievan apartment buildings are not the signature move of a confident military. They are the sign of one that is running out of better options and is trying to break civil morale because it can no longer break the military line. Others have put it that Ukraine has been increasingly effective in its deep strikes against oil facilities, and so Putin is not only losing money or men, but the momentum, and that is why he's increasingly terrorizing civilians. And Russia's own military bloggers, the pro-war voices closest to the front line, are saying the same thing, but in their own ways. Some have written on Telegram that they should conduct massive mobilization campaigns because Russians already foresee big changes and cataclysms because of the unfavorable dynamics. The question isn't about whether to mobilize, it's about how and in what quantity. And this is extraordinary, coming from pro-war military bloggers who would claim 6 months ago that Ukraine was on the verge of collapse. You do not call for mass mobilization if you're completely in control of your human and technological aspects of the war, especially on Russian state TV. And then this brings us therefore to the most significant development of all, and that probably gets the least coverage. Russia's propaganda register has shifted, not reversed, but shifted. This triumphalism has gone, and in its place is about sacrifice, endurance, things you would more expect during the Second World War. It reflects a calculation being made across Russian state media that the gap between what people are being told and what they're experiencing is becoming too wide now to paper over with victory narratives. You can't tell people that the war is going brilliantly when they're queuing for degraded fuel. You can't sustain a narrative of Russian strength when the government is formally announcing a temporary decrease in the quality of petrol available to civilians. And you can't project triumphant victory rhetoric when you're, seeing more and more people taken away to war. What Russia is doing instead is attempting a managed shift, moving the population from a victory narrative to sort of a siege narrative, from we are winning to we must endure. And that's a significant ideological transition, and it carries risks the Kremlin is clearly aware of, but hasn't yet developed effective contingency plans for. Russia is currently matching what economists define as a banking crisis. Its budget deficit has blown past projections in just 5 months, and the central bank governor disappeared because of what she calls permanent economic deterioration. Military spending accounts for roughly half the state budget, and then we need to get into the longer term capacities for the war economy to sustain the civilian one. All in all, Putin launched this war expecting a quick victory, but his 4-year attritional campaign is now reaching into Russia's own territory, affecting his and its own fuel supplies, and undermining his own propaganda apparatus, as people question increasingly, what is this all about? So from one of victory to siege mentality. Meanwhile, Ukraine is halting Russia's offensives and seeing its biggest gains off the battlefield, and now to the point where it's determining for itself where it can take the fight to, primarily in the air, all the while NATO continues to find ways to support Ukraine, both in physical and financial means. So in Ankara this week, they will be locking in 2 years of financial guarantees, integrating its defense industry, and seriously determining how Ukraine can help NATO going forward in this much more unstable, unpredictable world. But that's it, everyone, from me in this update. I'll be back tomorrow in the next few days over some latest developments or analysis, reviewing of the NATO summit, and just taking a breakdown of what's happening right now. You will see some of the backgrounds change as well, as I'm now sort of traveling for a bit of summer, sun and experiences, but still going to be continuing to follow and update with everything that's going on. Keep watching this space, everyone. Take care.